All right, today we're going to pick up with Washington's second term. And if you remember last time, we talked about the differences that were really starting to emerge between the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians. And that's really the beginnings of what we're going to call the first party system. So that's going to be a big theme of Washington's second term as well, as we're really starting to see the country divide between those who support Hamilton and those who support Jefferson. They're going to form political parties. These are going to be our first two parties. The Hamiltonians are going to be known as the Federalists, and they're going to support the policies of Hamilton: a strong central government, a U.S. bank, tariffs, and all of those Hamiltonian policies, while the Jeffersonians are going to be called the Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans, who oppose the strong government of Hamilton, and they're going to favor strong state governments. All right, so keep that in the back of your mind. That's going to be a big theme over the course of this discussion about Washington's second term. Okay, so if you recall, with Washington's first term, we talked primarily about domestic issues or things that were happening at home. I'm going to focus a little bit more on foreign policy issues with Washington's second term. All right. So first of all, context, historical context. There's a revolution happening in France. The American Revolution had in part inspired the French Revolution. And so initially, a lot of Americans, and remember, the French had supported the Americans in our own revolution. So a lot of Americans are going to support the French. However, it gets nasty, as you know, in France. And so there's going to be some division about whether or not the French have gone too far. So the Jeffersonians, the Republicans, the Democratic Republicans, are going to regret the bloodshed of the French Revolution, but they understand it. If you remember what Jefferson said, he said that a little revolution now and again is a good thing, that the blood of rebels and martyrs is the natural manure for the tree of liberty, right? Whereas the Federalists are going to oppose or at least be nervous about the implications of the French Revolution. Remember, if this revolution were happening in America, it would be the Federalists that would likely be the target because they were kind of the status quo government of the United States. Okay, so they're nervous about that mobocracy, that threat that they believed existed in the United States. Okay, so now there's a question about our relationship with France because we had an alliance in 1778 that helped us to win our revolution, and it's still in effect in 1793. And the question is, should that continue? France is now, there's a new government in France, and there's war on. They're on the verge of war with Britain, and the question is, should we continue to be in an alliance with them? And the Jeffersonian Republicans say, yeah, absolutely. We need to support those ideals. Remember, the Jeffersonians are those who tend to be more ideological. We owe it to France, right? We owe our freedom to France, and therefore we need to support them in their efforts to establish their new country. Hamilton's going to say, no, this is crazy. And if we do it, we're putting our own nation at risk. We are too young. We need to grow. We need to strengthen ourselves, and a war would be a disaster for that. And Washington's going to ask Jefferson and Hamilton to really share their opinions with him, and ultimately he's going to decide. And he doesn't need the approval of Congress. He doesn't believe that's going to be controversial as well, that he doesn't need the approval of Congress to decide whether he wants to stay with this treaty or whether he wants to back out of it. If you're familiar with Cabinet Battle Number 2, this is what Cabinet Battle Number 2 is about.
The issue on the table. France is on the verge of war with England. Now, do we provide aid and troops to our French allies, or do we stay out of it? Remember, my decision on this matter is not subject to congressional approval. The only person you have to convince is me. Secretary Jefferson, you have the floor, sir.
So who is Washington going to agree with? That's the big question. Well, Washington is going to side ultimately with Alexander Hamilton, and he's going to issue a proclamation of neutrality. After war breaks out with Britain and France in 1793, he's going to say, we are staying out of it. We're not going to honor that alliance that's been on the books since 1778. He's going to get a very angry response from the French, obviously, also a very angry response from the pro-French Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans. They're going to be mad because they support the French cause. They're also going to be mad because this is a proclamation of a president, right? And to them, this sounds too much like something a king would do. And they started arguing that there ought to be congressional approval for this. So the Federalists, who are pro-Britain, are going to be pro-neutrality, right? So Alexander Hamilton, again, wants a good trade, a good economic relationship, a trade relationship with Britain. And so we last thing we want to do is get dragged into a war from his position. Neutrality is actually going to be more useful to France than it would have been had we been allies. Arguably, we didn't have much to offer them militarily if we had been allies, but since we were neutral, we were allowed to continue trading with them, providing them materials that they needed to be successful in their fight against Britain. Britain starts to antagonize the United States at this point and starts to test our commitment to neutrality. They start to, refuse to adhere to the Treaty of Paris. They've got outposts in the Old Northwest, and we really start to see that the British are really testing us and our ability to remain neutral. They see some in Britain see an opportunity to maybe regain control of the colonies if we get involved in this war. They, like Hamilton, thought we were too weak as a nation to actually get involved in the war. So we are going to ultimately be battling the Native Americans on the frontier. They're being encouraged by the British to attack us. We're going to be in a really tough spot, and we're going to have to work something out. In addition to that, the British are going to seize American merchant ships and impress American sailors. They're going to say that these are British citizens. The Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, are going to be furious about this, right? And again, impressment is we've got Americans, people who have left Britain for America, and they're going to be recalled by Britain to the British Royal Navy. They're going to be pulled off of American ships. This is going to happen all the way through the early 1800s. You'll hear later about how this is a cause of the War of 1812. But the Democratic Republicans are furious. They're pushing for war, or at the very least, like an embargo. Let's cut off Great Britain. Let's only trade with France. Washington, amidst all this pressure, is going to remain neutral. He does not want to get drawn into a war. He and Alexander Hamilton are committed to this policy of neutrality, believing that our economic success as a nation is going to depend on trade, not with France, but trade with Britain. Right. So this is about the economic future of the nation. And the Jeffersonian Republicans see this as being about what's right and what's wrong. So Jay's Treaty. Ultimately, John Jay is sent by the president to work out a deal with Great Britain. So these issues are dividing America. They're bringing us to the brink of war with Britain. So he sends John Jay to go negotiate a treaty. And he does. He negotiates a treaty. And the agreement is that Britain will leave America. They'll abandon those outposts. There's some question of whether they're actually going to do that or not. They're going to pay damages for any merchant ships that they had seized. We are going to pay back our pre-Revolutionary War debts, right? That's something that they get. They did not make a promise to stop impressment. That upsets Americans, right? When John Jay comes back with this treaty, a lot of people are like, how did you not get them to stop impressing American sailors? So Americans are really divided over Jay's treaty. There's a lot of outrage, you guessed it, from the Jeffersonian Republicans, right? That this is too weak. It's really just playing into the hands of the British and allowing the British to continue to exercise control over the United States. Okay. So at the end of Washington's term, he writes what becomes known as his farewell address. He decides after 2 terms, he's done being president. This sets what we will call the 2-term precedent, right? It's not a requirement under the Constitution that a president only serve 2 terms at this time. It will later be added to the Constitution, but at this time, it was not part of the original Constitution. So Washington decides after 2 terms, that is enough. He doesn't want to become he doesn't want the office of president to become too powerful or too king-like. He doesn't give this as a speech, but it's printed in newspapers and people all across the country read it. He gives some advice, some really key pieces of advice. He says, number 1, avoid permanent alliances. This got us into trouble with France, right? We should have said that alliance in 1778 was only for our war with Britain. Let's just avoid permanent alliances, because France, had we honored that alliance, would have dragged us into war with Great Britain. So Washington's farewell address, and we'll reference this throughout the rest of the course, right? How well are we adhering to this? Was this good advice? Should we form long-term permanent alliances, or does that put us at more risk than is good? Should we have these short-term alliances? All right. In addition, he's going to argue or he's going to suggest that factions could divide America and that we should avoid political factions, which today we would call political parties, right? And it's really ironic because the first 2 political parties develop during Washington's presidency. the Hamiltonian Federalists and the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. Really, with Jay's Treaty, the acceptance and the rejection, that's really starting to create that fracture that's dividing these two parties between Alexander Hamilton's followers and Thomas Jefferson's followers. So while Washington is cautioning against the development of political parties, it's actually happening. And by the time he leaves office, we have what's called the first party system, which is the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Right, and that occurs on Washington's watch, even though it's ironic, right? He's saying in his farewell address, we should avoid political parties, right? Some other contributions from Washington as our first president. So following Alexander Hamilton's economic plan, we do start to develop the American economy. We grow the American economy. We start to grow naval forces, beginning with a merchant marine, right? These are our, during the Revolutionary War, what we would call privateers. These are private ships who at the time everybody had weapons because they feared that they would be attacked at sea and their cargo would be robbed. So they would now use merchant ships, private ships, to go out and attack the enemies, beginning with the American Revolution. Eventually that would morph into the Navy, become a United States Navy. Washington's neutrality proclamation kept us out of war, right? Arguably preserving our independence and our freedom. Okay, so just some kind of key ideas. Make sure you read this section. And Mr. McCarty is going to pick up with John Adams, who's going to be our second president. He's going to be our first one-term president. He's going to be elected to only one term of service, but McCarty will pick up there. All right, thanks.